Welcome to Early Returns, hosted by Jan Barron, a partner of Holtzman Vogel. This podcast examines law and politics and seeks insights from political players in elections, lobbying, media, and the law. Now, let's join our host, Jan Barron.
Welcome back to the Early Returns podcast. I am your host, Jan Barron. Our recent episodes focused on campaign finance laws, foreign lobbying, and enforcement. I hope you've had a chance to listen to them. But today we are shifting our attention to a different issue, voting rules and how elections are actually conducted. This is an election year and the first one after COVID in the 2020 elections. Under the Constitution, each state establishes the time, place, and manner of holding elections for senator or representative, unless a federal law changes a rule nationwide. That means that there can be 51 variations, if you include all 50 states and the District of Columbia, of how voters register and vote, when voters vote, when they vote, and how votes are cast and counted. COVID triggered some temporary changes in some states, and after the 2020 elections, many states evaluated their laws and passed new ones. All these events have led to numerous controversies, some lawsuits, and a major proposed bill in Congress called H.R. 1. Elections are conducted at the local precinct level, but in the vast majority of states, the person ultimately responsible is the Secretary of State. There are a handful of states that don't have a Secretary of State, but their elections are run by a board of elections and groups like that. Today, I am fortunate to have as my guest the Secretary of State for the Commonwealth of Kentucky, Michael Adams. Secretary Adams was elected to his position in 2019 and has survived the 2020 elections and recent reforms with success and very little controversy. That is an accomplishment in a state where the governor is a Democrat and the legislature is Republican-controlled and elections are hotly contested. Secretary Adams, welcome to Early Returns. I look forward to chatting with you.
Thank you, Jan. It's an honor to be here.
Well, before we get down to the nitty-gritty about how elections are actually conducted and what the rules are, I think it'd be helpful to our audience to know a little bit about you personally, like where you grew up and what did you do before you became Secretary of State?
I think my life began with this job. The rest of it seems like ancient history. But I'm from Paducah, Kentucky, first-generation college graduate. I did the necessary poli-sci major that most of us in this line of work do. Was fortunate to get into Harvard Law School. I attended on low-income aid. Wanted to be an election lawyer. I always loved politics. I worked on campaigns professionally even before I was old enough to vote. But I also wanted something to hang my hat on, a good credential, way to ensure I could have a good income. And so law school seemed like the right path for me. And I've been really fortunate to be able to combine my love of politics and my love of the law and be an election lawyer. So that's what I did for most of the 20 years of my practice before I was Secretary of State, is practice election law. I was counsel for the Republican Governors Association for 12 years. I was counsel for the Republican Attorneys General Association, National Federation of Republican Women, several large big-name politicians like Mike Pence and Nikki Haley. And so I was really fortunate to have that sort of practice background before I became the Secretary of State, because that gave me a really good insight into different states' laws and federal laws with respect to the election process.
It must have given you a pretty good insight as to what it was like to be a candidate for public office. Did you run for public office before you ran for Secretary of State?
No, my first campaign with my name on the ballot was in 2019, running for this. And I did 400 campaigns for other people before I ran myself. And nothing prepares you for that, to have your own name on the ballot and be the subject of all of that. But I'm glad I did that. I think I was better prepared than most.
What was that campaign like?
Ugly.
And by the way, for our listeners, it's important to let them know that Kentucky is one of 4 states that really has its state elections in odd-numbered years. That's not usual in states. Kentucky had its statewide elections for offices like governor and secretary of state, and I assume the legislature, in 2019, and will again in 2023. So when we're electing all of our federal officials, Kentucky is not really focused on the state and local elections by and large. And when you ran in 2019, this office of Secretary of State, which is statewide, I don't think it was actually been held by a Republican in a long time. Is that right?
There's been one other Republican in my lifetime. There's been 2, I think, since the 40s, something like that. There was Trey Grayson, who was in office at 2004 through 2011, and then a couple of Democrats who came before me. And I should say the Democrat who had this office before me was the top vote getter in the state. That was seen as sort of a Democratic office. But on the other hand, it was an office that didn't really have much of an identity. When I campaigned, the first question I always got was, what's the Secretary of State do? And there wasn't a good answer to that question. One reason I was able to prevail in that race as an underdog is the chief election official office talked about vote fraud, talked about election security. I ran against a former Miss America who had a wide lead in the polls the entire campaign. I was able to win an upset. Even with the Republican governor being defeated, I was able to survive that wave and prevail because I made the campaign and made the office about election integrity.
Well, what were some of the issues that you ran on?
The biggest was photo ID to vote. A lot of our states, of course, in the country, red states, blue states, Kentucky's neighboring states, are all states with a photo ID law. They've had them for years. In Kentucky, we didn't have a photo ID law. We had photo ID referenced in our statute, but it was a suggestion. It was discretionary, which I thought was problematic in two ways. One is, I think you got to ask for a photo ID for people who are voting. And the other is, even if I didn't think that, I would think that every county ought to have the same rule, whatever it is. I don't like the notion of disparate treatment of voters based on which county they're voting in. So this should be universalized. So that was a big issue where I was able to draw a contrast with my Democratic opponent. The other big issue is cleaning up our voter rolls. My predecessor was found in federal court to have violated the NVRA by not adequately maintaining the rolls.
Why don't you explain what those initials are for our audience?
Yeah, it's an alphabet soup in this business, unfortunately. The National Voter Registration Act of 1993 was an act of Congress that Wendell Ford, a Kentucky senator who had been governor previously, pushed. President Bill Clinton signed. It's not a Republican measure by any stretch. It was actually filibustered by Republicans, but it provided for a couple of things. One is basically every DMV, every welfare office, they all had to, when folks would come in and ask for government service, they had to offer them a chance to register to vote.
So that's the exception that I mentioned in our introduction here today, that this is a case where Congress stepped in and passed a law that didn't make a change or instituted a federal law that applied nationwide with respect to voter registration, which in the absence of a federal law would have been a decision made by the state or local jurisdiction.
That's right. And some states did provide for that and some didn't. And here too, Congress and the president thought that it would be ideal to have a universal law nationally to say that wherever you live, if you go to the DMV or if you go sign up for benefits or whatever it is, if you're interacting with the government, that's a point where the government should ask you if you want to register to vote. It wasn't automatic voter registration. It was still discretionary on the voter's part. The other part of that law, though, was, and this is part of what helped it survive a filibuster, was, okay, well, you're going to have all these new registrations coming in. It's appropriate to make sure that we don't have duplicates, to make sure that the rolls are accurate, they're maintained by these states. And so there was a requirement also that the states maintain their rolls, that they take active, vigorous steps to make sure that they were accurate. And so, unfortunately, Kentucky was found in violation of that law in 2018 before I ran for this position. And so that was a big issue I talked to audiences, Democrats and Republicans about is let's get into compliance. This is embarrassing that we're being dinged by a federal judge and found to have violated the law. Let's get these rolls cleaned up. That enhances voter confidence too. People knowing that we don't have phantom voters on the rolls who don't live here anymore, who've passed away or what have you.
What do you do to ensure when you kick names off the roll that you haven't made a mistake, that the person really is dead or has actually moved out of the jurisdiction? How does that work?
A couple of things. There's really two types of people that we can take off. The ones that we can take off immediately without any paperwork, and then there are the people that we can't. I'll address each of those. So we have stepped up the reporting frequency that we get from other state agencies, the courts, the Bureau of Vital Statistics, where they tell us people who have been judged mentally incompetent. Under our Constitution in Kentucky, they have to come off the rolls. People who've been convicted of felonies, they have to come off the rolls. People who've passed away, obviously, they need to come off the rolls as well. And so we've stepped up that frequency. This is not something that we're just getting tips on our phones. Oh, this guy died or this person was convicted. We're conferring with other state agencies, and specifically agencies not controlled by Republicans. I want to point that out. That we're working with them in good faith to make sure these rolls are updated. But the second part of this is the more complicated part. That is, taking people off the rolls who aren't felons, who aren't dead, who aren't mentally incompetent, people who are still alive, who just have not voted in a long time. In most cases, those people have moved out of state and they're voting in some other state. And until recently, our law didn't allow me to do anything about that. I could try to track them down, send them a letter and ask them to pretty please come off our rolls, but they usually just didn't respond to those letters. Something that we got added to our state law, which is consistent with federal law, is there's a great deal of interaction between me and my colleagues in other states. Now I'm allowed, I wasn't before, now I'm allowed to actually, on their certification, take voters off of our rolls who have registered in those other states. And vice versa, we can also trade that information and basically get both states' rolls cleaner. Because we don't want to have a situation where someone moves to Ohio and they can vote in Ohio and vote in our state and not get caught. Something else that we do, there is a lot of chatter on some fronts on the right about ERIC. ERIC has been a godsend to us. Of course, you know what I'm talking about, but I should probably explain what that is. There's an interstate consortium. It's been around for a while. Kentucky just joined it right as I was starting here. This allows the states to very frequently trade information in large batches. It also allows us to get quicker updates from the Social Security Administration. Let's say you're a snowbird in Kentucky and you spend 3 months a year down in Florida for the winter and you pass away down in Florida. Well, I don't necessarily get that information from Florida quickly, but I can get it from the feds more quickly because of this ERIC agreement. So we had a month last year, we took almost 11,000 dead voters off the rolls in 1 month, and it was because of ERIC. So I want to say good things about ERIC despite all the conspiracy theories out there about it. But these are the sorts of things you have to do to be in compliance and keep these rolls clear so you don't end up with, as was the case before I came to office, some counties that had more voters than voting-age citizens.
Have there been many complaints about your efforts to update and keep accurate voter rolls? I mean, have there been any lawsuits, God forbid?
Actually, there haven't. Right after I got elected, I got a threat by the NAACP to sue me before I was even sworn in based on my promise to clean the rolls up. And we've actually, in most of my months in office, we've taken more voters off the rolls and we've added voters to the rolls. But we've done it in a fair way. We've done it in a transparent way. And our policy is before we do a purge, we actually put people's names up on the website and say, hey, this is you, and we're making a mistake, tell us so we can fix it. So we've been really, really transparent about it. We've been fair about it. And I think our efforts on other fronts of election policy, making it easier to vote, expanding access, has given us some street cred with people that normally would be litigants against us.
Based on your election experience, where you ran on these types of issues, having voter identification, having accurate, clean, up-to-date voter registration rolls, it sounds like that was a winning issue for you. I mean, you were not the favorite candidate when you decided to run for Secretary of State, and you apparently won by a fairly comfortable margin. Were these issues important to Kentucky voters?
Yeah, I think so. I think they'd never been confronted with a real choice for this office. It'd always been sort of a personality contest sort of position. And this was the first time someone made the race a referendum on election policy. And I found that Democrats want to vote with a photo ID too. Democrats want the rolls to be clean too. This shouldn't be a partisan issue. As I said, Democrats passed the MVRA, but nevertheless, there was a contrast between my opponent and me. And I was down 15 points in August of my election year. I was down 8 points with a week to go. And then I went on TV with a contrast ad and won by 4 points. And this is, I think, the way it ought to be. That's not to my own horn, but I think that the voters ought to have a choice to make these sorts of decisions and know what they're getting when they choose someone for this office. I think one upside maybe of 2020 and the years since has been people see this office now. They know what it does. They know how it affects their lives. And they're being presented with a pretty clear choice in most states between a liberal and a conservative, and they can make those choices.
Well, it's the nice thing about elections. It's really the final, most accurate poll one can have.
Absolutely.
It ratifies not only the choice, but the reasons for the choice that the voters make. That really didn't give you a whole lot of time to prepare for 2020, which was kind of a test, a challenge for all election officials dealing with COVID, dealing with an extraordinarily hotly contested campaign, not only for president, but you had a lot of tough House and Senate races in 2020. There was a lot of fighting about the rules for voting. And of course, Kentucky has always been one of my favorite states, only because I knew that on election night, as just somebody watching election returns on a national election, I knew that the first returns would always be from Kentucky, because Kentucky votes from 6 in the morning until 6 p.m. and Of course, polls in all the other states, even in the East Coast, are open at least until 7, if not later. And we would always have the first indication of an accurate voting result from Kentucky. And in 2020, I suspect that there were a lot of changes made because of COVID and because of what was going on with the elections, which must not have been consistent with really the rules that had been in place for a long time in the Commonwealth.
Yeah, between 1891 and 2019, the year I was elected, there was one election code, essentially, that never really changed substantively. From the voters' perspective, you had 1 day to vote from 6 to 6, and those hours were set in the Constitution. The Constitution allowed the General Assembly to expand them if they chose, but they didn't choose to do that. So we had the shortest and also the most inconvenient voting hours of any state in the country, because we literally designed our election system at a time when people got on a horse and rode to the next county over to find their precinct. And everyone lived on the farm. But virtually no one in our state in 1891 worked in the cities. They didn't commute to work. They didn't have a kid in school with soccer practice, all that kind of stuff. We really had an election model based just kind of steep in amber from 1891 that we never got around to revisiting.
Did you have absentee voting?
We did, but extremely limited, very limited absentee. And so like clockwork in every election I was in, it was about 2% absentee. And you could actually project the turnout based on the absentee because you just multiply it by 50 and that was your turnout.
And was that absentee by mail?
Well, voters had two options. They could vote absentee ballot by mail or they could vote absentee ballot in person. The county clerk's offices run the election at the ground level and they'd have a machine in their office and voters could come in a couple weeks beforehand and vote in person if they chose. So 98% of voters voted on 1 day in a 12-hour span.
Yeah. What changed in 2020?
Well, a lot changed. I was sworn in January 6th of 2020, and 2 months to the day later, we had our first COVID diagnosis. And I started flipping through the law books, and I found a statute that said that if the governor and the Secretary of State agree, an election can be delayed by up to 5 weeks. So I went to the governor, immediately agreed, we need to delay this election. And we had plan A and plan B. Plan B was we need time to prepare for this pandemic election. But plan A was we thought COVID was going to go away. And if you remember, in March of 2020, everyone pretty much thought that this was going to dry up, that the sun was going to come out and the virus would disappear. And so that wasn't a crazy thought that if we just pushed the election till summer, it would go fine. Of course, it didn't. COVID didn't go away. And fortunately, plan B was at least we've got time to figure out what we're dealing with. What we ultimately ended up doing was the legislature was in session. They had to abort their session due to COVID. This is before, not just a vaccine, but before masks. This is that long ago in history that no one knew what the heck to do with COVID. So the legislature adjourned. Before they did, they passed a law that I asked for, which was to take the existing emergency powers law to let the government jointly agree to delay the election. And they amended that law to augment it and say that we could also make decisions about the election mechanics themselves. And what I like about that was I'm a Republican. I worked for Mitch McConnell. I ran a conservative campaign, and the governor is a Democrat. And I thought it would be appropriate to have the two of us together in the room, both having to turn the key to make changes. I didn't want Republicans saying, oh, the governor took over the process, or Democrats saying that I took over the process. It needed to be bipartisan for the whole public to have confidence in that system. So what the governor and I did, ultimately, we got that passed. The governor vetoed it. It was overridden, including by Democrats, ultimately agreed to work with me. We made some major changes on a temporary basis. The biggest, of course, was we allowed for functionally no excuse absentee. I should say COVID excuse absentee. COVID was a pretty good excuse in the spring of 2020. Again, this is before masking or anything that we know of as preventive measures. This allowed voters, if they chose to vote absentee, about 3/4 of our voters did that in our primary election. The key to getting that done and having the voters be confident in that system was them seeing us take security measures that hadn't existed before. The biggest one was we introduced a portal that allowed voters to request their absentee ballots via a secure website. That added convenience to the process, but the more important part of that was it added security. Because to get that ballot, you had to have some sort of identification. Your driver's license number, your other state ID number was part of our validation. But we never had that before.
Did they have to download a picture ID?
No, they were able to punch in their driver's license number, which we were able to, through an MOA with the Transportation Department under the control of the governor, we were able to confirm that. And that's how 98% of our voters vote, who vote with the photo IDs with a driver's license. We also had the ability to accept other photo IDs through a different process, but almost everybody voted with a photo ID via the driver's license. We also, through this portal, allowed voters to verify their own ballots were being submitted to them and then received back and then counted. And we kept the portal. It was very popular. But it was a tough go at first. Obviously, President Trump at the time was condemning mail-in voting, and that's not what we did. Under a vote-by-mail system, like about half a dozen states have, there's no checks like this necessarily. They basically just mail out a ballot to everybody on the voter file. That would not have been feasible in Kentucky because, as I said, we had voter records that were not up to date when I took office. And so I didn't have confidence that we could just mail these ballots out to everybody on this file and get them back. We could have had more ballots cast than voting age citizens in some counties. So we didn't do that, but we did what most states do, including Florida, where President Trump votes, which is to have an absentee ballot with an application process, ID verification, and so forth.
Was there, in addition, in-person early voting at the county or precinct level?
In addition to making absentee voting more available and improving the security protocols around it, we also expanded the number of voting days, 2 weeks in the primary and then 3 weeks in the general. And interestingly, even in a pandemic, even pre-vaccine, voters preferred to vote in person. That was true of Democrats, Republicans, urban voters, rural voters, as they loved the in-person voting. They really took advantage of it. The counties that had the highest turnout of early in-person voting were the most rural, most Republican counties. And that kind of surprised some people because the conventional wisdom had been, this is a liberal idea, it's something Democrats want. Well, in Kentucky, it wasn't. And actually, there's some logic to that. If you look at how the two parties have kind of traded bases over the years, the Democratic Party now is sort of the professional, well-educated elite voter party, and the Republicans are more the lunch bucket voters like the blue-collar family I grew up in. And my family used to vote Democrat. Now they vote Republican. And that's really true in many cases across the board, at least in Kentucky. And so the voters that tended to be the most favorable toward the expanded in-person voting were Donald Trump Republican voters. So coming out of that process in 2021, there was a call to keep some version of expanded voting. And it came just as strong or stronger from the right as it did from the left. Totally different politics on this than you usually see. And so in 2021, and then again this session through a couple of measures, we went back to normal with the absentee voting. If you have an age or illness or what have you that keeps you from voting in person, you can still vote absentee ballot. But again, even in COVID, most voters, including most Democrats, wanted to vote in person. So what we ended up doing was expand the number of voting days. We have no excuse early voting for 3 days before Election Day. We also have an additional 6 days of excuse in-person voting days, so for a total of 10. I'm not one of these people that thinks that infinite number of voting days is ideal. At some point, you get diminishing returns. You compound the cost of running the election, and you also distort who wins and loses. I wouldn't have been elected had there been weeks and weeks of voting in my election year because I only had enough money to get on TV for a week. I can point to you Democrats that are in the same position who would have won their election but for long early voting in 2020. So I think the sweet spot is what we did, which is a few days right before Election Day. That's when voters are paying attention. That's when the candidates are on the air with their messaging. That's when the mail pieces land, is right at the end. People are focused at that point. They're not focused a month before Election Day about who they're going to vote for. All you do is compound your costs and distort the outcome. So I think Kentucky found the sweet spot.
You all have really stood out, in my opinion, in terms of changing your election procedures, providing for more opportunities, more flexibility on voting, but not necessarily adopting what I would call sort of the reformist liberal wish list. They would oppose voter ID. They would insist that you ought to have drop boxes for absentee ballots all over the counties and states, and that you should be able to have political campaign workers provide water and refreshments to voters who are standing in line to vote, and think issues like that. It doesn't sound like those were issues in Kentucky, number one. Number two, notwithstanding the fact that there might not have been so many controversial issues, having legislators change the rules on how voting happens is a very sensitive process because it affects every legislator's own election possibilities. And yet this all came to fruition. And as you say, you haven't even had lawsuits objecting to this so far, and I don't think you're likely to. How is it that work in Kentucky, but doesn't seem to work in states like Texas or Georgia or even Florida, where changing the election laws seems to be the modern political version of hand-to-hand combat that goes into court constantly? What's your observation on why that worked in Kentucky and doesn't seem to work elsewhere?
Well, it's not an accident. It was a strategy that my team and I followed, which was basically being bipartisan and being seen as bipartisan. We gave the Democrats some things that they had wanted. They had wanted to make it easier to consolidate voting locations and to have places where anyone in the county could go vote regardless of precinct, because a lot of Democratic voters in our experience, more so than Republicans, ended up not getting to vote because they went to the wrong location. A lot of Democratic voters don't vote every year. They vote for president. They come out and vote for that. And so they miss the fact that their precincts change, their locations change. And that was an idea that I borrowed word for word from a Democratic legislator and put that into this measure. Expanded voting. That's something Republicans hadn't particularly had an interest in previously. I borrowed ideas from Democrats for this stuff, but I also borrowed plenty of ideas from Republicans. And what we did is we put it all together into an omnibus bill where everybody got something out of it. The Democrats got voting access expanded without having security keep their voters from voting. And Republicans got security measures they needed to take home to their constituents without really losing anything on the access side either. So what we did is we just handled the politics much differently. What Texas and Georgia and Florida got wrong, I think, is not the substance of their laws. I think their laws are very defensible. The problem was they had think tanks and caucuses meeting privately, working this stuff out, and then they rammed it through on a party line vote. And half the voters of the state feel disenfranchised. They feel like the rules are being rigged. They're not, but it's just a bad look. We got the optics right in Kentucky, and that's part of how we got this done on a bipartisan basis, and everybody believed in it. And may I add, to your point about H.R. 1 you were referring to a moment ago, this federal legislation, that's Texas on steroids. If you think it's inappropriate for the Republicans in Texas or Georgia or Florida to do their own party line thing, working with think tanks and special interest groups, well, my goodness, how much more must you oppose what's happening at a national level where Democrats in Congress are trying to do the same thing, except it's their version of what the election looks like, to ban our states from photo IDing voters, ban us from cleaning up our rolls, requiring us to subsidize campaigns with taxpayer dollars. You see the hypocrisy here where the people who are complaining about state level stuff are turning a blind eye at the federal level.
So would your point be that local election systems need to reflect local culture, local politics, but at the same time, not disenfranchise people or create unnecessary stumbling blocks, but also preserve confidence in the election process? And that all kind of starts with really the politicians in that jurisdiction and the election administrators. People are confident when they see everyone putting the rules together in a way that inspires confidence and makes sense.
That's right. We've done a lot of polling on this, and people trust the governor more than the president in Kentucky. They trust the local officials. And it's true of me. It's true of all of us. Is the closer you get to the local level, the more control people feel like they have, the more listened to they feel. And so people are comfortable with the county clerks that run our elections at the local level. They go to church with them. They see them at the grocery. They went to high school with them. They trust those people. They make great messengers for what we're doing. And I think the governor and I are pretty effective too, but less so than the local folks. In Washington, no one trusts Washington. Who the heck trusts Washington? Who says we need Washington to fix something? We need Congress to fix something. No one trusts Congress. So why should we trust Congress to do this stuff?
Sure.
What people saw in America in 2020, I'd like to say, is that they saw Kentucky rise to the occasion. We were the first state to have a successful election during the pandemic. Several states went ahead of us and botched it. We didn't. We got it right. We did a good job of it. And I credit our local election officials more than myself. They did a great job on the ground running this election. And so when I see that, what I don't think is we need Washington to come over and take it all over and boss us all around. Let the states do it themselves. We've proved here in Kentucky that we got this. We don't need Washington to tell us what to do.
We've talked about how back 30 years ago, Congress, as a result of a Kentucky senator, passed a law that provided for mandatory registration opportunities when you went to the Department of Motor Vehicles and got your driver's license and things of that sort. That's an example where Congress passed a law that applied across the country dealing with election procedure, and that seems to have worked. It seems to have increased voter registration, although not necessarily voter turnout. That's dependent on other things. H.R. 1, the bill that both you and I have referred to, which, as its number indicates, was the number one legislative priority of this Congress when it came into session, is a massive proposal to nationalize many things in our election process. It's about 1,000 pages long in its original form, just to give you an idea of how complex and pervasive it is. And it not only involves voting procedures, but also the administration of elections, vote counting, campaign finance. It even mandates redistricting commissions and the way the states have to redistrict all of their congressional districts as well as their legislative districts, I assume. Why would Congress propose that? It's so inconsistent with the way this country has operated and intervenes so pervasively in the way each state sets up its own processes. I mean, New York is going to vote in a way that's very different than Georgia. And by the way, New York has more restrictive voting processes than the state of Georgia does, which was covered by the Voting Rights Act. Why do you think Congress made that proposal, which is not likely to prevail at this point, but it can always come back?
Well, it's because Democrats control Congress, and I think Democrats have less pro-federalism viewpoint perspective than Republicans do. Democrats were big federalists in like 2017 or so when they didn't control Congress or the presidency. And you saw very vigorous state-level activity by governors and legislatures and attorneys general that were Democrats, kind of staking out their own territory. But the nature of the Democratic Party, all things being equal, is they trust Washington more than they trust states, certainly the South, certainly Georgia and Texas and Kentucky and Florida. That's, I think, part of the Democratic Party's worldview, but part of it is just the nature of Congress. Congress thinks that they know everything better than the rest of us. And that's actually true sometimes of Republican Congresses too, is they want to make decisions at the national level and tell us kind of all what to do. So you got a couple of biases there. But look, Utah is a Republican state, actually way more red than my state, Kentucky. They've got a vote-by-mail system. They just mail ballots out to their registered voter file. You know what? I trust their ability to do that. I trust them to run clean elections, and it's their decision, and that meets their local culture. And I don't want to take that away from them. I respect that. But I also want to protect my state. We've got a culture, we're a rural state. People like going to vote at the polls. They see their neighbors. They see their friends. It's a big social occasion to go out on election day, and they want to stand in line. They want to see people. Again, this is Democrats too. That's just how we are. Even a pandemic, voters want to vote in person. And so voting access in Kentucky, I believe in absentee balloting for those who need it. But I think the gold standard is to go vote in person if you can, which is what people prefer to do. You know, back in 2020, when I did no excuse absentee in the primary, I got called a vote suppressor. We had the most open election we'd ever had, and I got called a vote suppressor because there are fewer in-person voting locations. People wanted to go do that. So guess what? We listen. Now that's our gold standard, is to pivot toward expand opportunities to go vote in person, because that's our culture in our state.
Under the new system that was passed, you have this 2-week early voting period. Do you need an excuse?
You get 3 days of early voting, no excuse, and you have another 6 business days, which basically takes up about 2 weeks altogether of days. If you can't vote in person the other days because you're out of the county, you're traveling or whatever it is, you can go vote in person on those additional 6 days.
Okay, very interesting. I mentioned that H.R. 1 has something to do about redistricting as well. And that, of course, is going on everywhere. Every 10 years, we take a census, and then we have to reshuffle all of our congressional districts and then the state legislatures and on and on. What's going on in Kentucky with redistricting so far?
Well, I've been sued. So nothing personal. Under our state law, this has been this way for a while. If there's a new map enacted by the legislature, whether it's for Congress or one of the 2 chambers of the legislature or more than one of those, my Secretary of State's the chief defendant. And so it was the Republicans that sued over this in 2012. The Democrats controlled the governor's office and the House, and they influenced redistricting. And so it was Republicans that sued back then. And then today, Republicans control the legislature. And so it's the Democrats that are suing. So we were fortunate. We got a ruling a couple of months ago from the judge here in Frankfurt that hears these cases. The court denied a motion for a temporary injunction, which would have required me to reopen candidate filing, would have required pushing the primary to some indeterminate point in time, and a bunch of radical things that the Democrats asked for. I was sued by the state Democratic Party. Interestingly, they sued me. They asked the judge to re-implement the map that they wrote when they controlled Frankfurt 10 years before. So they had no problem, apparently, with gerrymandering. It's just that they wanted to be the gerrymanders, even though they were voted out of power. So the judge agreed with our argument that that was not appropriate, ruled in our favor, allowed the elections in Kentucky to go ahead and proceed, which I think is good, frankly, not just for me and for the people that run these elections, but for the voters and the candidates that have been out there running already. Let them go ahead and have their elections. However, the case isn't over. We expect the judge to issue a ruling this summer. The judge has reserved the right to say he'll let the elections proceed this year, but that he may come in and decide that either the congressional lines or the state house lines, both of which were challenged, one or the other or both are unconstitutional, and essentially compel the legislature to reenact a map for 2024 and forward. So we actually might have different maps in 2020, 2022, and 2024. I hope not, but that's possible.
Yeah. That is the saga of redistricting. The census may occur only every 10 years, but redistricting litigation goes on for each year in a 10-year cycle somewhere in this country. It's a remarkable process. Let me switch back to a topic we cover regularly on this podcast, and that's campaign finance. I know you're not technically in charge of campaign finance rules as Secretary of State of Kentucky, but that's something you obviously are familiar with as a previous practitioner advising clients on compliance with these rules, including in Kentucky. What are the rules like in Kentucky generally for your state and local candidates? Are they like the federal rules?
To make it real simple, they are very much like the federal rules. We ban corporate money. It actually is in our state constitution that we ban corporate contributions to candidates. It used to be that all corporate money was banned. Obviously, with Citizens United, we now interpret our state constitution to allow for independent spending, unlimited personal spending, unlimited corporate spending, as long as it's disclosed. The only real difference between us and the federal rules at this point, our limits are just lower. We've got a $2,000 per election limit, which is lower than the current federal limit. We don't adjust ours to inflation. But really, otherwise, our coordination rules are interpreted along a similar fashion as what the FEC is interpreted.
And your enforcement doesn't seem to reflect that there's an awful lot of abuse going on at the state level, at least. Maybe there is. I mean, I assume that there are candidates who file their reports late and get penalized and things of that sort. But really, the major campaign finance case stemming from Kentucky was in a federal election, not in a state election. Is that right?
Yes, we had a sad state of affairs. But to be frank, part of why I'm in this office is my predecessor ran for the U.S. Senate, and her father used his business to benefit the campaign, basically to funnel support to her campaign, which, of course, you can't do for various reasons. It violates the amount limit, violates the source limit, and none of it was disclosed. So you had kind of a trifecta of corruption there. He was indicted, and this is a former two-time state Democratic Party chairman, so very much a prominent individual. He was charged, he was convicted in federal court, he was sentenced and has been sent to federal prison. And that was part of the background, if you will, of what was going on with this office when I was running. And it's an issue that candidly helped me get people's attention and made them feel there was a need for a change in the office. But let me add, the biggest state campaign finance case that we've had was about 25 years ago, but I really can't tell you how big this case was. You had the governor's chief of staff, several of his aides. You had a major union. You had others criminally charged by a Democrat attorney general who found there had been felony coordination. Basically, at the time, we had public financing of our governor's race. This is in 95. Public financing of our governor's race, tight spending limits, and those were circumvented allegedly. And so the Democratic attorney general, to his credit, he's now the chairman of the State Board of Elections, honorable man, Ben Chandler. He brought charges and they went up and down through the courts for 7 years. Ultimately, the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed those charges. And then right before the trial, the Democratic governor pardoned everybody and the issue went away. So one thing I like to point out is, this perception of the evils of money and politics and all this kind of stuff is usually aimed at Republicans. People think that Republicans have all this secret money we want to slosh into the elections. But at least in Kentucky, it's been the Democrats that have been on the receiving end of all the charges under these laws.
Well, I think that the incidence of corruption is historically bipartisan. And it really depends more on the individuals and their character and integrity than it does on party identification. But I agree that the focus on getting, quote, the money out of politics is somewhat misguided, because the problem is the people, not the money. And you can do certain things about the money, but you're never going to get it out of politics, because
that's right.
It's just like saying, I'd like to make a living, but not without the money, and succeed here or anywhere for that matter, and be able to provide housing and feed my kids and do everything else. Money is important just as a means to accomplish different things, but you want to do that honestly and with integrity. Secretary of State Adams, I really appreciate the enormous amount of time that you have provided to us today, and congratulations on what seems to be a very, very successful and promising beginning of your tenure as Secretary of State. I know you don't have to worry about re-election for a couple more years, but
next year.
We are hopeful that you'll consider running for re-election. And when we close out these episodes of Early Returns, I'd like to ask my guests to suggest any books or reading that they have enjoyed recently or would recommend to our listeners. It doesn't have to be anything dealing with politics or law, but we've had a series of interesting reading suggestions from recent guests, and I would welcome your suggestion.
Well, I'll tell you, the book I just finished, it's part of what currently is a 4-part series. Maybe it'll be longer, but there's an excellent historian named Rick Perlstein who's written a series of books that explain, that record the rise of the conservative movement in American politics. There really was none until the 50s at the earliest. There were parties, but there really weren't ideological movements the way that there are today that actually dictated the two major parties' platforms. And so Rick Perlstein wrote a book called Before the Storm about the Goldwater movement and the takeover of the GOP from the Eisenhower-Nixon wing of the party to what we know really now as the Goldwater wing of the party. A second book was called Nixon Land, about the Nixon administration and how Nixon took advantage of all of that. The third book, which I just finished, is called The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan, sort of walking you through how the Nixon version of republicanism gave way to the Reagan version following the Ford challenge in 76. And then the fourth book I've not read yet, it's on my list, called Reagan Land. But here's why I recommend these books. I was born in 1976, and so I grew up in the 80s, and what I remember of America as a kid is the 80s, which seemed kind of tranquil and peaceful. There was a lot of consensus. It seemed like you had national elections won by landslides by one party or the other. And now we're in an era of polarization, which didn't really show itself in that period. But really, we've been polarized for a long time. We really have been, at least since the 60s, with all that came out of the 60s. Those divisions never went away. And Rick Perlstein does a really good job of showing you those. We didn't necessarily fully realize them. There wasn't cable news. There wasn't the internet. There wasn't Twitter. But these things have been going on for 50 years, these divisions, these anti-establishment movements, whether it's medicine or the election officials or whatever it is. These things have been bubbling under the surface for 50, going on 60 years. And so part of what I get out of these books is a bit of, believe it or not, optimism that we've always had these divisions. We've always managed to supersede them somehow through leadership. And so it's kind of nice to know that there wasn't some halcyon era and things are different now. Everyone always thinks things are much worse today than they were at some point in time. No, they're always this way, but we found a way to power through it.
Thank you for those recommendations. These are the 4 volumes by Rick Perlstein, basically a history of the conservative movement in America. And I'd like to double your observation. I'm a little older than you are. I mean, I immigrated as a very young boy with my family to the United States after World War II. And of course, my Polish father always liked to point out that immigration was very much a hot issue then, particularly criticism about the number of Slavs that were coming in from Eastern Europe, where the communists had taken over, which was true of our family. And that the leader of that criticism was Mr. Republican Bob Taft of Ohio. But we always felt lucky to be here. And my parents were Democrats to begin with, because we first lived in Chicago. And the first visitor to their new apartment was the local precinct man from the Democratic Party, who was there, even though they weren't eligible to vote for 5 years, was there to help. But when my dad passed away, I just want to say we went through his wallet and we found both a membership card for the Democratic Party and a membership card for the Republican Party, since he apparently had sent in some modest contributions to both organizations and felt that he was totally integrated in his new homeland here in America. And there were divisions, but that would be one way to reconcile divisions. Secretary of State Michael Adams from Kentucky, thank you so much for your book recommendations and for your time here. Thank you for being on Early Returns. This podcast and our earlier podcast episodes are available on Spotify and Google Podcasts, and hope that you listen to some of those and will be able to join us for our next episode. Thank you and good day.
Thanks for joining Early Returns, Law and Politics with Jan Barron. We hope you will join us for future episodes, which will continue to bring you voices and insights from the people engaged in our political landscape.